Conference USA, an unrehearsed discussion program. Join us now as our panel of reporters interview a personality in the news. To introduce our guest and the news correspondents, here is William McCrory.
Food experts predict abundant grain crops this year in most parts of the world. For the first time in 5 years, it looks as if there will be no major food crises or famine. But these same experts warn that the margin between too much and too little is a very thin line. Our guest today is very directly concerned with both world and domestic agricultural problems. He is Secretary of Agriculture Robert Bergland. He will be discussing these problems and such issues as national and international grain reserves at the coming World Food Conference in Manila, and with leaders of the nations he will visit during his trip to the Far East. Secretary Bergland has had wide experience in agriculture. He was a farmer himself in his home state of Minnesota and was once a regional director for the Department of Agriculture. The Secretary served 3 terms in the U.S. House of Representatives, where he was a key member of the House Agriculture Committee. Mr. Secretary, welcome to Press Conference USA.
Thank you very much. It's good to be with you on this day.
The news correspondents on our panel are Edward P. Morgan, Washington broadcast commentator, Ulrich Martin of the Financial Times of London, and Neil McNeil of Time magazine. For the first question to Secretary Bergland, we'll call on you, Mr. Morgan.
Secretary Bergland, you're going out to the World Food Conference. I've had the good fortune of just coming back from China, which, as you know, still cannot feed itself and is having to buy millions of dollars worth of grain abroad. But this grain is being bought from Canada and Australia, not from the United States. Are American farmers missing an important market because the administration hasn't moved fast enough to resolve a full diplomatic recognition of China?
I think that is essentially accurate. In fact, President Carter has ordered a review of the foreign policy of the United States from every perspective, and the Department of Agriculture has a foreign policy. We administer a part of Public Law 480, a food distribution program, and the President has said that we are going to re-examine the policies of the past, and I hope from that we will see trade relations established and expanded with the PRC and other such places.
As a concomitant to that, Secretary Bergland, would it be logical to think if and when relations do normalize between the two countries, that you would be able to send experts out to China to help them in terms of increased agricultural production, mechanizing, industrializing their agriculture?
We can provide them with technical assistance, of course, and maybe we can establish some kind of commercial trade both ways. I'm sure there are things we have and can produce that they can use, and hopefully there are things they can produce that we need.
Mr. Martin.
Mr. Secretary, are we going to have an organization of wheat exporting countries along the lines of OPEC, which the American government has often denounced, I should say, as a cartel? You've had negotiations with the Canadians on this. There's a possibility that other countries, such as Australia, may be invited to join. Is it a realistic possibility?
Not such a thing as might be described as OPEC or cartel, but we are talking with our friends in Canada about our respective problems and posture in the upcoming international wheat conferences, which will commence in July or June and extend on through this year. And that the United States has about half the reserve of wheat in this world. We are about half the commercial trade in wheat in this world. The Canadians are about 1/4, and so the two of us have 3/4 of the world trade and the world's inventory. We think it is unwise for the United States and Canada to get into a knockdown, drag-out price war for the benefit of some third country. Rather, it would be better that we go into these international commodity conferences agreed in principle on the need for establishing some kind of a global grains policy in wheat.
That includes a minimum price, I presume.
That will include a minimum price, hopefully a corridor with a maximum price, and that the enforcement provisions would be triggered by automatic retention or sale of surplus stocks.
Mr. McNeil.
Mr. Secretary, the Congress, as you well know, has been considering a new farm bill. And the Senate has just passed such a bill, a vote of 69 to 18, substantially over what President Carter has asked, and in such a dimension that you have been quoted as saying that the President may well veto it. Will he veto that bill?
He'll veto the Senate-passed bill.
He will veto the Senate-passed bill.
I'm convinced of it. The estimated cost, or I should say outlay, the term cost is a misnomer in that a substantial amount of that money in that Senate-passed bill is represented by price support loans. That's an outlay, however, even though it's repaid with interest. It is still a budgeted item, and it exceeds the President's budget by double. And he won't approve that.
But the President's request is substantially less than what he indicated he would support during the campaign. And Senator Muskie has said, and Senator Muskie tried to cut that bill to get it within the budget limitations. Senator Muskie has said that the Senate voted to support the President's campaign promises. I gather he is not, the President, that is.
Well, I think the President is fulfilling his campaign pledge. In a number of places he said and repeated that he intended to support policies which would provide farmers with incomes that would represent the cost of production, but he would not have a federal program which would guarantee a profit. The target prices which we have recommended to the Congress, we, the President and the administration, have supported target prices of $2.90 on wheat, $2 on corn, and proper relationships on other prices, and these we will argue do represent a cost of production.
But, Mr. Secretary, wasn't the administration, you and the President, forced to these prices? The original requests that the President made were substantially lower than that. Well, were called cruel by some of the members of the Congress.
The original proposals did represent the out-of-pocket cost of production plus a 3% return on land. And that meant $2.60 wheat and $1.75 corn. And we were not able to get that approved, and so we came back with a 6% return on land, or $2.90 on wheat.
You yourself used to be a quite distinguished congressman from Minnesota, known as a farm congressman. If you were still in the Congress, would you have voted for the Senate bill?
Yes.
Is there a paradox here?
No,
Is
I don't think so.
A changed constituency?
Changed constituency. When I was in the Congress, I represented the 7th District of Minnesota, and I did it as well as I could. Now I have a much broader constituency.
Mr. Morgan.
In a way, you have a world constituency, Mr. Secretary. Given the malnutrition and indeed near starvation of millions of people in the third and fourth worlds, there's been much talk about trying to establish a world food bank. Do you consider that totally impracticable? What is your view on it?
No, I regard a world food bank or reserve system of some kind as being absolutely essential. If we were to have or should have a balance between supply and demand of any grain in this world at any time, it will be the result of good luck, not something I or any other leader has done. The weather will have more to say about the size and price of crops than anything that any government may do. Can't control the weather and can't forecast it, unfortunately. And so, really, I think the principles found and recorded in the 41st chapter of Genesis apply today. Joseph, I think, was the original Secretary of Agriculture in Pharaoh's Egypt about 300 years ago, and he invented what we now call the ever-normal granary. Then and since and even today, we find good years and bad. We need very desperately to reserve grain in good years because the bad years surely will come.
Why is it that we can go to the moon almost with ease and send a gadget to Mars to spade up the Earth, and we can't predict the weather?
The weather is a very dynamic thing, and we're in the process of revamping the Department of Agriculture rather substantially to try to apply and understand weather data which is being accumulated not only in our own country but in many parts of this world. I've talked with climatologists, with leading weather scientists, and while we're good at 60 days, or reasonably accurate in that period of time, we're much less accurate in 6 months, and in terms of trying to measure a year ahead, it's impossible. So our scientists are trying to extrapolate from the past to see what kinds of curves and models we can find, and I don't know what this will hold, but we are going to get as good reading as we can to try to anticipate what may happen here and abroad.
The world does seem to be getting cooler, at least the northern hemisphere is behaving in that direction, wind currents changing and so forth. Has this had a disastrous effect on farm crops?
Well, there have been strange weather phenomena in this world recently that we don't understand. The drought in California, for example, a record breaker. The drought in the entire West Coast is the most intense ever reported. And in other places we have rains that just seemingly won't go away. And we don't understand why this has all taken place, but we do know, as you correctly stated, that the world has tended to cool down. And going way back in history, we find that there have been cycles of about 22 years in which the weather will change with some predictability. And of course, we had during the 16th, latter half of the 15th and 16th century, the world cooled off considerably, and we had a kind of an ice age of sorts.
Mr. Martin.
But if you're to avoid the glut-famine cycle of recent years, which now apparently, at least there is no shortage of food for the immediate future, you're going to need to establish some very, very sizable grain reserves in the United States and presumably in Canada as well. American wheat reserves are now at something over 1 billion bushels, but I take it that's not enough. Have you got any sort of idea, or could give us some idea of the sort of size of American reserves which would be necessary to prevent to tide the world over in a time of famine?
We really don't know what the size ought to be. That's what we plan to discuss at the upcoming wheat conference in London in September, I think. The United States represents half the commercial trade in wheat, half the trade in rice, half the soybean trade in the world, and we're going to go to these talks prepared to assume our share of the cost, but we cannot be the world stockholder and pay all the cost of storing all the grain. And we don't think it's in the interest of the consuming countries to have their food basket in one place. They too ought to have a financial stake in the reserve management and decision-making.
I see. One of the dangers, I presume, when there is a plentiful supply of grains in particular, and they're not particularly expensive at the same time, is that developing countries who might otherwise be investing in agriculture are persuaded not to, simply because they have easy access to ample supplies. Would you see the United States playing, or can you imagine the United States playing a role whereby it would not, or perhaps might refuse requests for certain wheat supplies, shall we say?
Well, I think that's very probable. In fact, I think it's desirable that we, in the United States and other countries, use this reserve stock very judiciously. There have been times when we have dumped, to use a word, rice, Bangladesh, for example, and dropped the price to the point where their own industry was driven to the wall financially. That was an unwise policy. I'm convinced the world does not want to be a continuing candidate for American charity, but rather wants to develop economically, and that we can develop a trading policy. Commercial trade is really the only way the world is going to feed itself.
We'll have more questions for Secretary Bergland in just a moment. This is Press Conference USA, an unrehearsed panel discussion program. Our guest is the U.S. Secretary of Agriculture, Robert Bergland. The news correspondents on the panel are Edward P. Morgan, Washington broadcast commentator, Ulrich Martin of the London Financial Times, and Neil McNeil of Time magazine. Well, Mr. Secretary, as we continue the second half of our program, I'd like to come back to the economic role of the United States in the Far East, since you'll be going out there soon. How do you see our role there, particularly in the view of grains and foodstuffs?
We think the Far East has a tremendous potential as a market for American grain, and we think that American aid can be of great importance in those countries who are searching for ways of improving their own economic circumstances. You know, a 1 pound increase of consumption in chicken in the People's Republic of China represents a 1 million ton demand for feed grain. And that's the kind of thing we're looking at, and we'll continue to help build as time goes on.
Mr. McNeil.
Mr. Secretary, I'd like to turn you back again to Mr. Carter and his budget. Just how important a priority, in your judgment, is it with President Carter to balance the budget as he has pledged by 1981?
I'm convinced he means business. When he and I talked about the Senate bill with the cost, which we discussed was substantially in excess of what he had agreed to, he fixed those blue eyes on me, and I've never been more sure of anything in my life. And I know that he will veto a bill that is as costly as the one written by the Senate. The first test, I think, will likely be the Health, Education, Welfare Appropriation Bill, which apparently is coming in excess of his budget. And if he vetoes that, that's a signal to everybody that he's drawn the line.
Well, this is really a struggle, with, and every president has it, over priorities. Would you say his budget balancing is an absolute top priority with him, against new programs, against extending existing programs?
I wouldn't say it would preempt extension of existing programs, but it would certainly preempt the passage or development of any new programs. I don't think we're going to have a national health insurance policy unless it can be funded within the budget.
Let me turn it now, this idea, if I may, to your department and your concerns. What does this budget balancing mean to the farmer, for example, in terms of the prices that he will get for his produce, and how will it affect his production?
We really can't tell because we don't know yet what the president will agree to in terms of agricultural budgets. The 1979 budget is now being constructed, and this will be the first Carter budget. We have and are working under a zero-based budgeting concept, which is really a tremendously important management tool. I'm going to be spending most of July and August in budget hearings in the department. That's the first time ever. We'll be eliminating projects and missions down there which have either outlived their usefulness or are not cost-effective. And that kind of examination is going on government-wide. I don't know how much we'll save as a result of that, but I'm sure that the elimination of duplication will result in some savings and certainly reduce confusion.
Well, what I'm asking you in terms of savings, budget savings, is doesn't those savings have an effect on production, that the farmer has less incentive to produce?
Depends on how deep the cuts come. Obviously, if the price supports for basic commodities were increased far in excess of the cost of production, that would serve as an incentive and would stimulate production. At the moment, however, we don't need wheat production stimulated. We have enough wheat on hand, the largest carryover in 13 years.
Well, I was thinking also in terms of overseas sales.
And the largest wheat in his world, largest wheat stocks in his world have since 1973, I think, are now being reported. And so there's no immediate need for increased wheat or rice production in his world.
Mr. Morgan.
Secretary Bergland, few, if anybody, would deny that we're the best-fed nation in the world. But many people think we're the worst-fed nation in the world in the sense that we eat too much of the wrong things, too much marbled beef, cholesterol problem, too much sugar, too much cola, etc. Does the Agriculture Department, with or without the necessity of having to get rid of some of your activities, have any program for explaining to the farmers and the consumers about rational diets?
We're not very good at that. In fact, the President has announced that he is going to fund and ask for new authorities, if need be, to undertake a substantial commitment in the area of human nutrition. The Department of Agriculture has a human nutrition program going now, but it's very modest. We know much more about the nutritional needs of the dairy cow than we do the human body. There has been much published about cholesterol, but not very much has been done in the way of scientific research to see whether indeed cholesterol is a harmful thing. We see, interestingly, there are populations in this world that literally live on dairy products, and yet they live to be very old. And so the environmental problems, and particularly eating habits, is a matter which has not been studied very much. We intend to do so. The Department of Agriculture, I think, can be, and I will argue should be, the lead agency in this regard, so that we do know whether or not meat or animal fats are good or bad, and if they're bad, why, and what do we do about them? And then provide education to the consumer so that the consumer knows what he or she is getting for their money.
We've got something like 10 million people in this country suffering from malnutrition. Isn't that partly a responsibility of the Department of Agriculture?
It is indeed. And here again, we have an area in which USDA has not really been equipped nor budgeted properly. We have a program going through the Federal Extension Service in which we counsel with people who are on the food stamp program so that those persons have a better idea what they're getting for their money. They sometimes are bamboozled by commercial advertising, and some of these food products are, well, they're healthy, they're not cost effective. And we have a program going in USDA, but it surely could be much improved.
Mr. Martin.
How bad is the drought in the West? You touched on the subject earlier, but would the effect of another dry winter be really catastrophic?
It would be very, very difficult for the United States and for much of the world, in fact. California is the leading agricultural state. It is the leading state in what we call table food production. And we depend heavily on fruits and vegetables, for example, from California. That state produces 1/4 the cotton, 1/4 the rice grown in the United States. We're going to get through this year, but they're drawing on water reserves like there's no tomorrow. And if the snows don't come this winter, California and the United States will be in serious trouble next year.
When does California run out of water if they have a dry winter this time? I mean, that means that next year's harvest would be shot.
That's correct, because there's no such thing as rationing water for a growing plant. You either provide it with enough water to stay alive or you kill it. And they're drawing on their mountain water reservoirs. I was there. They're down near the bottom. They'll get by this year, I think. They're drilling 5,000 wells a month out there, I'm told. And water table in the San Joaquin Valley has dropped 35 feet in this year. There's saltwater intrusion coming into the Salinas Valley. There are all kinds of problems, and we simply cannot draw those water reserves down any further next year without catastrophic results.
Mr. McNeil.
Mr. Secretary, some 5 years ago, the Nixon administration made what amounted to an open-ended deal with the Russians on the sale of wheat, where I think the general consensus was the United States got rather badly ripped off. What would happen under your administration if the Russians came to us again for wheat?
We would sell it to them. We have plenty of wheat. The Russians are good merchants. They understand the American system of marketing very, very well. They knew then and know now that no American grain firm or any other individual is permitted to own futures in excess of 3 million bushels for the purpose of speculation. So when the Russians come, or any other buyer, as a matter of fact, comes to the United States, they're buying from merchants who are selling grain they don't own. They then move into the market and buy to cover that sale. It is necessary, therefore, that the buyer and seller maintain strict secrecy and confidentiality in that trade. Otherwise, the seller can't get in to cover.
Yes, I understand that. But one of the difficulties, apparently, with the Nixon administration is that their agricultural people did not understand how much grain the Russians needed, and the sales were much greater than they expected, which drove up American prices and so on. What kind of protection would you have in a similar situation to know just what the Russians were about and what they were up to?
We have two protective devices. In 1973 or 4, the American government entered into an agreement with the Soviets that they will take certain amounts of grain at the minimum, and they are exchanging weather information with us. We know a lot more about what their crop conditions are like than was known in 1972.
You spoke of the Agriculture Department now having its own foreign policy. How effective, in your judgment, is food, or can food be, as a diplomatic tool for the Carter administration?
It can be a very effective tool. It's a question of how shall it be used. It's been, in my lifetime, the major farm problem has been how do we live with too much? We've invented hybrid seed corn and fertilizers and pesticides and machinery, and yields have doubled and tripled, and we've had crop controls and surpluses stored up in government-owned bins. Public Law 480 was a surplus dumping device. The basic thrust was get rid of the grain no matter what. That's all changed now. We need to use that program to help countries develop themselves, and food aid can be very important in lieu of currency.
Excuse me, are there any countries that you are now being consulted about for the use of food as a diplomatic tool?
Not in terms of using it as in the sense that it's a club of sorts in trying to extract a quid pro quo. No, I don't know of any such situation currently under discussion.
Mr. Morgan.
Mr. Secretary, we've had world conferences on practically everything, from women to population, certainly another one on food in Rome, and now you've got a new one in Manila. With trying to avoid the occupational reporter's disease of being cynical, do these things accomplish anything? What do you expect this one to accomplish, and where do you think the collisions will occur?
Well, we're going to this conference to tell our friends in this world that we will cooperate completely in establishing some kind of a world food security system, and that we're prepared to pay our share and make a contribution to this and go there in a good faith effort. Now, what will come, I don't know. I've thought about these meetings too. I've attended a lot of meetings that may have been in the aftermath regarded as a waste of time, but one never knows. But I think the question of food reserves and food distribution and food production is so important that we cannot afford to let these things go untended.
Yeah, I'm certainly not a banker, but and I understood and appreciated as a citizen your remark a while ago that the United States can't be expected to feed the world itself and foot the bill. Is it realistic? Is it possible that if you get a world food reserve, which we in Canada will certainly be the major contributors to, that alongside of that you get some kind of a bank that will help finance these foodstuffs to the various countries that need them? I'm talking way over my head, but...
Well, it is really a central question, of course. How will these exports be financed, or imports? And the Export-Import Bank has a role to play. There's a group of about 77 of the so-called less developed countries in this world are proposing a common fund to which all developed countries would make a contribution that would aid in the financing of exports and imports of various commodities. We're not sure that that's the better way to go, but there is a need for having some kind of a credit system available because many countries don't have convertible currencies. Maybe we ought to work up some kind of a barter arrangement. I'm rather impressed by that.
Mr. Martin.
What sort of commodities which come under your purview as Secretary of Agriculture do you think would be suited to international commodity agreements and perhaps facilitated by a common fund?
The first candidate would be sugar. Next would be wheat. Questions then could be directed to cotton and probably feed grains in due time.
Are sugar and wheat on the administration's so-called short list of 4 to 7 commodities which they're prepared seriously to talk about?
Yes, they are the 2 of the 4.
Yeah. No other foods under that?
No other. No, sir.
Mr. McNeil, time for a very brief question.
The cost of living has been jumping up again in the United States, particularly because of food prices. When will the food prices start coming down?
Well, the problem is that farm prices go up and down, but food costs only go one way. I mean, the price of wheat is half of what it was 2.5 years ago, and I haven't noticed any drop in the price of bread. And the same is said of sugar. 2 years ago, the sugar prices were 60 cents a pound, and candy and jellies and sauce and other such manufactured goods went up substantially. Sugar is now 10 cents. It's a disastrous price.
Why is that?
Well, there's increased processing costs mostly. Labor costs increased, transportation costs, energy costs. Everything has gone up. And the consumer, therefore, has not had the break of reduced farm prices.
Well, Mr. Secretary, thank you very much for being with us today. Our guest was Secretary of Agriculture Robert Bergland. The news correspondents on the panel were Edward P. Morgan, Washington broadcast commentator, Uric Martin of the London Financial Times, and Neil McNeil of Time magazine. This is William McCrory in Washington.